Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome to another video of History Valley podcast. Today, I am joined by Professor Robyn Faith Walsh, and today we're going to be discussing her upcoming course on Myth Vision podcast titled The Gospel Masterclass Understanding the Gospels as Literature. And the link to purchase the course will be in the History Valley affiliate link below, so you can get the course now before it officially comes out. So, welcome back to the show, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you for coming on. So, can you tell us a bit about what this course is about?
Well, it's actually the second course I've done. The first one was on Paul, and so in a way, they're a little bit. It's not quite like a prequel and a sequel, but in a way, we were trying to get at carving out an understanding of especially the first and second centuries of early Christianity and the social development of that movement, of the Jesus movement, both from the side of sort of on the ground, what we know about how people were organizing, how they were engaging in dialogue and discourse about Jesus. So, from the side of, say, Paul and his quote unquote mission, going around trying to coalesce different groups. And then later on, how the Gospels come forward with a history of both the Jesus movement at the end, but also the life and times of Jesus and his teachings. So in this case, with the gospel course, what I was trying to do was do a bit of a sort of build from the ground up, almost like a little bit of a construction project, trying to go back to what do we actually know about these texts? What do we know about the authors? And from there, contextualizing it within the ancient Mediterranean context of literature. So, how do you produce literature like the Gospels? What kind of information can we derive from the status of those texts to reconstruct that social history? So, a few things that we do in the course are not only talk about what do we know about these authors, from what can we tell from the texts themselves, the fact that they use koine, the writing style, how especially the synoptic gospels are exchanging different kinds of stories, but also changing them, but also try to figure out from the work of some scholars that are already out there kind of speculating on things like how many Christians were there. What can we imagine in terms of numbers? How many Christians existed in the first century and the second century? At what point there's somebody named Keith Hopkins who writes on this, for example, what can we extrapolate? So we're trying to do a combination of creative reworkings of history along with what the field already pretty much the standards of the field for understanding these texts and the early Jesus movement.
So, when you're going through the Gospels in this course to understand them as literature, it's not necessarily about trying to figure out which pieces of them reflect the historical Jesus, which pieces of it attributes accurate sayings to Jesus or not, but it is to understand it as literature in the literary context it was written in Greco-Roman society.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to try to think, we do actually talk about the historical Jesus, or I talk to the camera about the historical Jesus, but as a collaborative effort. But in part, it's to try to figure out, okay, based on what we know from literature, what can I reasonably deduce from these texts that might be relevant to a historical Jesus enterprise? So, in other words, if you see some features of the Gospels that look very much like ancient Greco-Roman biography, or say if we see some features that are very clearly from the Hebrew Bible, but seem to be, it's almost like what the Jesus Seminar used to do, but with a difference. What can we say about what seems to be constructed from the literary side and what seems to be something that we might attribute to, say, oral tradition, or why would we trouble that? So I really tried to lay out all of those factors. And I've been on the show before. I think anybody who's seen me talk about these issues before knows that I try not to weight these things in a way that I make a determinative statement that says absolutely this is the case or not the case. I always try to just present things as well as I can, and say, for example, this kind of goes back to Paul, and we talk about Paul in one of the classes in the course. But Paul seems very concerned with the risen Christ. He does talk about the historical Jesus, what we would call the historical Jesus. And he lays out a teaching. He talks about these divination experiences that he has where Jesus, for example, as Christ tells him what happened in the Last Supper. Um, Uh-oh, there's going to be a fire alarm. I just
It's
heard
okay.
it. So sorry about that if that happens.
That's
Um,
okay.
but he talks about that, and in antiquity you wouldn't distinguish between, say, a divination experience and something you receive from oral tradition. In a way, they're very, very similar. So he does tell you some of those things, but the concern is with the risen Christ, and you see some of that come through in the Gospels as well. So we can do that kind of comparative work, and we do that kind of comparative work to think about not only what can we say with some, let's call it, reliability about the so-called historical Jesus, but I also, in the course of doing that, try to talk about what do we mean by historical Jesus, because in many ways that construction, that idea of the historical Jesus, is wrapped up with contemporary ideas about history telling and contemporary ideas about how something becomes quote unquote fact, and doesn't factor in things necessarily in our modern sensibility like divination experience, like I just mentioned, where in antiquity that would have been seen as, if it's coming from an authority like Paul, or at least someone claiming authority like Paul, that's later taken as authority or as authoritative in the New Testament. I don't think in antiquity you would have necessarily distinguished. So the historical Jesus gets troubled in that way as well.
When you look at what Paul says in First Corinthians about different groups, and he seems to be not very happy about their rivalry to his group. Like, okay, some people say, oh, some of them are of Paul, some of them are of Apollos, and then say he says some of them are of Christ. And you talked about just a moment ago that the historical Jesus is separate from the risen Christ that Paul preaches. Could this be could this be possibly reflected in what Paul talks about in First Corinthians about the of Christ sect that do not follow his teachings and the teachings of the other leaders he mentioned?
Could you say a little bit more about what you're thinking there in terms of those, just like that there's a historical Jesus that they have in mind that Paul doesn't subscribe to? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's basically my question.
So that's an interesting question, because I would wonder. I think Paul has in mind a very distinctive kind of. I mean, of course, this goes back to the question I just said about what does a historical Jesus mean, but I think he has a very distinctive idea about how much uh, things like the practices that are lined up for those who are part of Judaism are not applicable in terms of covenant to the people that he is trying to bring into Christ. So I could certainly see competing narratives, and this seems to be implied in what Paul says, of, for example, people saying you have to circumcise, and that this is part of the teachings because of how much the historical Jesus seems to have relied on the teachings or relied on the Hebrew Bible, or at least on Judaism, of the teachings within Judaism and the structure of Judaism within his own teaching activity. If there is an oral tradition related to that, that always seems to me to be the big distinction between Paul and these other groups, and the thing that he's resisting the most. And for those who seem to have just, again, kind of mirror reading what Paul's doing, that he has those in competition with him talking about being of Christ, but also sort of taking on that ancient philosophical idea of sharing in Christ and the spirit and pneuma sort of being this connecting element. There does seem to be some distinctions there. Again, do you circumcise? Do you not? What dietary practices do you engage in? And to the extent that some of this is also coming from, say, divination experiences of the risen Christ, you can also see how some would say, well, I've also seen the risen Christ, and I have a different take on what he has said. Does that explain or answer your question?
Yes, I would say that it does. And when you look at the way Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus, is it pretty much the same as what the Gospels tell us about the resurrection of Jesus minus all the extra details that they add? Or is Paul's conception of the resurrection of Jesus distinct from the Gospel's point of view?
Well, I think that Paul gives a bit more texture than you get from the literary standpoint in terms of his understanding of the resurrection, for a few reasons. One is that I think Paul has to do a little more explanation than you get in the Gospels. The Gospels as literary products don't have to go into that much explanatory force to indicate what they understand about the resurrection. They can just state that Jesus appears to people, or have those kind of post crucifixion, resurrection appearances, and they're part of a literary motif. What Paul has to do is a little bit more of a systematic explanation of the significance. And I happen to be a scholar who thinks that the gospel writers are aware of Paul's writings, especially the Last Supper that we talked about, or the Lord's Supper. The way that that's explained in the gospel seems to me to be exactly the way that Paul describes his understanding. Now, you could attribute that perhaps to oral tradition, except that Paul says it is a divination experience. And I've talked about this elsewhere in a couple of places, but also I gave a paper on this at the Society of Biblical Literature conference in November, but I did it virtually. So we're including that lecture in the collection for the course. So it's a scholarly paper being read aloud, but it talks about this very particular issue. Paul has to go into much more detail about those things than the gospel writers do. And to the extent that they are already reading Paul, there's sort of a predicate there, either because there's a collective understanding at that point, especially because Paul's understanding of Christ, of these issues, becomes the dominant principle. And becomes something that, again, I think is part of the literary borrowing of the gospel authors. You don't have to explain it as much. So to my mind, the gospels don't necessarily convey, say, for example, the cosmic elements of what Paul seems to be describing in terms of the resurrection. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians the person who's gone up to a certain level of heaven and he's not sure if he was in his body or not. Or in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about celestial bodies. You see some echoes of that kind of language in the Gospels. One thing that I find really interesting, I've mentioned the work of Erin Roberts before. She also presented at the Society of Biblical Literature and noted that where epilepsy is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, the word is actually moonstruck. There's a lot more of that kind of cosmic imagery that's in the Gospels that tends to kind of get smoothed over from modern translations. Paul does more of an explanation of that kind of stuff. He seems to have more of a philosophical understanding of what we would call the afterlife, the nature of Christ. I think he basically sees Jesus as the starry figure up in heaven. Whereas the gospel writers are focused more on that storytelling element that takes that principle and turns it into, again, post-resurrection appearances, turns it into that foundation for understanding the spread of the Christ groups or the Jesus movement after Jesus' death.
Do you think that the Gospels were written possibly to provide a more elaborate story about Jesus as some sort of response to Paul's letters? Because Paul doesn't really tell us a lot about Jesus.
I think that there was certainly a demand for that. This is where I deviate to some degree from those who authorize an idea of oral tradition, and I do talk about that in the course as well, because that's a lot of weight to put on generations of multiple people maintaining the same precise story. I think that because there was a certain sense of the end time being imminent for Paul, that there wasn't as much concern about revisiting the teachings of Jesus or his miracle working. In fact, Paul says very little, if anything at all, about the miracle working. I think there was not as much impetus to worry about those things when you think the world is coming to an end. The immediate term is more important, like how do we graft Gentiles into this movement? And, Paul is advocating, again, we're going to have these pneumatic bodies that, live in God's kingdom, and Jesus as, the Savior is going to come down and, rid the world of evil, right? Like this is the message of Paul. You're not worried so much about the ethical instruction of the historical Jesus in that kind of context. I think that's what the Gospels provide. And my theory on this, and I don't think I'm alone in it, but just to give one guidepost for thinking about what I've described as the social fabric of the first century, especially as it pertains to the Jesus movement, is that the Jewish war, I think, had a great influence here for a number of reasons. One is, and I talk about this in the course too, the Gospels appearing after the Jewish war and why. I think before the Jewish war, we had people like Paul who see the end time as imminent and are talking about that end time and seeing it as immediate. The Jewish war happened. I have to imagine that on the ground, people thought that war, when it began with Rome, the great evil and occupier of that territory and of the Jewish people at the time, that must have seemed like, here comes that end time scenario that has been predicted, and this is where you would expect Christ's return, or you would expect the Messiah to come as a liberator, and it does not happen. And so I think that this is why you find the Gospels after that war, both as a reflection on that war, as a revision or a re-examination, to the extent that an oral tradition existed, of what was known about the historical Jesus and about his workings, but also his teachings, to kind of go back over, like, what did we miss? Or, how do we live our lives now going forward? Because the thing that was predicted did not happen, yet there's still faith in this movement. So therefore, how is it reimagined? Under that kind of redemptive structure, you can understand why there would be an emphasis on, say, Jesus uh, healing people, or giving some kind of ethical instruction for how one is to live a life that goes on, that doesn't go into that afterlife in the immediate term, if you see what I mean. And also, I've written elsewhere that although Jesus does talk about the temple, because temporally, in terms of time, he's existing, he lives when the temple still stands, his ethical instruction does not actually require the temple. He's not telling anyone that you must go make a sacrifice uh, after this temple is no longer standing. His ethical instruction tends to be along the lines of how to live a moral life within that structure of contemporary Greco-Roman, and this includes Jewish ideas of moral behavior. Or he says he's here to intensify the law, right, in Matthew. So I think those become the focus because people are looking for a way to move forward in the movement at the time. And in terms of genre presentation or literature, it was definitely, of that time, natural to write a biography of holy men, of leaders, of philosophers, of notable figures. So that spans the gamut, from people like Alexander the Great, Augustus, to Aesop, to Pythagoras, to Asclepius. Jesus seems to be in their ranks, and so this is just what you do.
And what about the Q source and potentially other gospel sources like M and L? Do you think that they also fall in the same literary category that you would place the gospels in? And what kind of influence are they having on the gospels, looking at it from that context?
Q is an interesting case because I tend to take a little bit. So, of course, let's just get out of the way the fact that a lot of scholars don't think Q existed. It's a hypothetical document. So many people don't want to waste their time, or maybe that's too facetious, but many people don't want to spend too much time talking about a document that nobody has found, that's hypothetical. But let's talk about it for the sake of the question. And I have written about it. We don't actually have strong evidence that Q is pre-war. The idea of hypothesizing Q as being a pre-war document, so relative to what I was just saying about the Gospels being written after the Jewish War, the benefit to postulating that Q is a pre-war document is that it creates sort of like a ladder, because we don't have any sources other than Paul before that war, particularly on the historical Jesus. If you suspect or suppose or propose that there is something, a Q source, an M source, an L source, and you date them before that war, then you can say it's oral tradition, or you can say it had different versions that you can trace back further and further and further. And there's this tendency in the field, and I talk about this in the course as well, to say, well, Mark 13 talks about the destruction of the temple, so let's date Mark to 70. And then I'm guessing it takes 10 years for Matthew to write his gospel, so let's say 80. And then maybe 10 more years for Luke. This is all very speculative, but you can see how it builds by decade a justification for going back to the historical Jesus. And so my discomfort with Q is only that, obviously, again, other than the hypothetical nature of the document, is that it tends to be wielded as a theory to do that kind of laddering. And so we talk about that in the course, to just, again, lay that landscape. My issue with that is that we tend to also imagine communities around each sort of topic change within Q. So when it seems like there's an apocalyptic element to Q as it's reconstructed, people will say, well, that was the apocalyptic community. And if there's wisdom literature reflected in Q, sometimes scholars will say, well, that's the wisdom community. And you can also see the effect of positing communities for even layers of Q. It tends to create a sense of what I've called elsewhere the early Christian Big Bang, this sense that like Jesus came, everybody just abandoned their previous lives, there was no messiness, and then boom, like community, community, community. That gives a stability and a foundation to the Jesus movement that sociologically I don't think was necessarily there. And to the question you asked me before, Paul demonstrates this by talking about there's another Christ group, and there's those who are part of Apollos here and there, right? You can see, and even for the Corinthians are not quite understanding Paul correctly and what he intends. So to the extent that those kinds of sources are hypothesized to justify an understanding of Christian landscape that I think seems more cohesive and populated than I think was the case. This is why I talk about Christian number. How many Christians can we reasonably say, based on the documents we do have, were around? How many Christian groups do we think were actually around? So based on that, I also think, ML considered as these special sources could just be the perspective of the author who's writing the gospel. You don't need a special source behind that. And then the general tendency to speculate about saying sources versus narrative gospels, again, does that kind of work of replicating the theory of oral tradition. And certainly the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas added to that. And there's important conversations to be had about that, although Thomas seems to have been much later. And as a genre, a literary genre, a collection of saying sources, not exclusive to Christianity, also happens in things like Pythagoreanism. And we don't postulate, Pythagorean communities per se. We might talk about different schools, but the idea of oral tradition there, I think, is in a different key. It's not necessarily tied to the idea that we can reproduce precisely the thing that was said by Pythagoras, as much as a tradition within a particular circle of literate producers, which I've also talked about elsewhere. Does that make sense? I think just
Yeah.
as a literary practice, we have to make sure we're very clear when we mean something sociologically and when we mean something in terms of literature.
Right, absolutely. And when you look at the gospel interdependency, the consensus view that Matthew and Luke copied Mark, and maybe John knew them all as independent, or he just knew Mark.
It's hard to say. Yeah.
Right. There's different views on that. Are they trying to build off of the literature in Mark, kind of maybe in the same way that Mark, the author of Mark, whoever that person was unsatisfied with the very little stuff that Paul says about Jesus, and maybe Matthew and Luke think that Mark leaves out too much details about Jesus, so they're going to build over that, and maybe John to some point feels the same way, but doesn't quite cover the same details as they do. Do you think that's what's going on? We're seeing this literary building, and my second part to that question is, how does Matthew? Is there a difference in the way Matthew, Luke, and John fit within Greco-Roman culture versus that of Mark?
Okay, so remind me of the second part of the question after I'm done with the first, in case I lose
Sure.
it. I think we have something really interesting going on with the Synoptic Gospels, because I think you do see that literary borrowing, and I think what happens is you see evidence of different points of emphasis for each author that you might boil down to differences in how they want to construct their biography, certainly, but the things that are traditionally attributed to something like redaction criticism, I think, just reflect that they're I think sometimes the concept of competition is overused, but let's use that word just for the sake of this discussion. And I talk about this too in one of the lectures in the course. what Mark does is create something that's very esoteric. Jesus is just kind of like all over the place. I think at one point I say, imagine the Twilight Zone music playing as you're reading it, because Jesus is here and here and here, and nobody understands who he is. And I have a couple pieces coming out this year about how that tradition of the hero not being recognized, or a subversive figure who goes unrecognized, is elsewhere. It's in the epics, for example, in Homer and Virgil. I think that's what Mark is doing. So he's doing something very particular. It's a foundational narrative for the story of who Jesus was. And he is a hero in the tradition of the epics. And so that's what he presents. I think Luke actually does something pretty similar. There was a book about 20 years ago by Marianne Palmer Bond's Luke is Epic. Luke, I think, is thinking along the same lines, imagining Jesus as this foundational figure in this hero story. And especially if you include Acts of the Apostles too, they're all heroes and they have a much more dramatic journey in Luke. But Luke also seems to be, he's the best writer, and he seems to be well aware of the tradition of the Greek novel. And so he's making it, not so dry, I guess. He's sort of making it, he's got the baby Jesus story and like everything, he has more detail there. He has songs, if you go to Acts, he's got shipwrecks. So he's doing a lot more in terms of bringing narrative focus to that gospel. And then I see Matthew doing two things. On one hand, as everybody recognizes, and this is why he's the first book in the New Testament, is he goes back to the Hebrew Bible to reflect on Jesus as the predicted Messiah, on those elements of those holy scriptures of the Jewish people as an authorizing strategy for who Jesus was. This is why you have Jesus as often is said, the new Moses. I referenced this a moment ago. He says, I'm here not only to bring the law, but to intensify the law. So this is where you get the Sermon on the Mount. Luke has it as a sermon in the plain, but you have Jesus on the mountain in Matthew because he is the new Moses giving a new law. And really, that becomes a central focus of Matthew. But he also has all that cosmological stuff. He has the star and the magi following the star. He's got people who have moon sickness. He has a lot of philosophical ideas in the text as well. So I'll cite Erin Roberts again and her work on Stoicism as it appears in Matthew, with how Jesus is sometimes angry in an interesting way in that text. So there's a lot of different texture to each one of these gospels. And then, of course, you have John, that's very back to the idea of cosmological, has a different, we might call it theology, of course. This idea that Jesus, was co-eternal and pre-existent. You have different stories with different points of emphasis in that particular gospel. That gospel also becomes, unfortunately, for our ideas of historical Jesus, a bit of a clearinghouse for stories like the adulterous woman that, kind of float around the tradition and need a home because John's a little bit disjointed in its storytelling. But so each of these you can see has that kind of, again, if we want to use competition, it's almost like Matthew reads Mark and he's like, where are the, where are the references that we need from the Jewish holy books to justify this, and Luke looks at both of them and goes, amateurs, like I can do a better version of this that's more engaging. I don't know that they thought that at the time, but you certainly see those different takes on how to tell the story in a compelling way. And then what was the second part of the question again?
And how does that relate to this? I think it was an interdependency, or was that the
You were asking me specifically about how different gospels interact with each other.
right, right, right? That
Yeah.
was the first part. Yeah, my second part would have been then. How does each gospel change within the Greco-Roman context from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John?
What do you mean by Greco-Roman context?
Do they become more Greco-Roman in some ways, or do they regress in certain ways?
Well,
That's my
that's
question.
interesting. One thing I bring up in the course is to think about dating, because I am not terribly satisfied with our current dating system, as I indicated before. there are reasons, and some scholars continue to question why we date the Gospels even to the first century. I'm not quite ready to say they're second century yet. But if I were to just kind of, based on your question, speculate, I think that you have, I see more Pauline dependence in Mark, especially the way that he uses technical terms like pneuma. Very much, I think, corresponds with what you find in the letters of Paul. And that paper I mentioned that I gave at Society of Biblical Literature, that's included in the course. I actually show a side by side comparison of Mark and Paul and all the points of contact I think you see systematically through Paul's letters reflected in the Gospel of Mark. So, how to read the Gospel of Mark with Paul in mind, and you see all of these parallels where I think I'm pretty secure that Mark is trying to write that kind of text. So when you get to Matthew, I think Matthew continues that view of Stoicism, which I think is underappreciated in that gospel, in part, I think, because of the reliance on Mark. But also, that's the Greco-Roman world. I mean, this is a Hellenized Jewish movement at this stage. And so you're seeing that reflected in the gospel itself, along with these other kinds of elements that we've been talking about. And the addition of relying on the holy books. So, as a religion of the book, you see that very much detailed in Matthew. By the time you get to Luke, let's just say, there's a chance all three of these are around the same time, and we're actually seeing three authors sort of overwriting each other simultaneously. So, it might not be so much of a progression. But by the time you get to Luke, I see more of an effort there where I'm more secure that you have an established Christian group. You have a movement that is cohesive and self-sustaining. And this is why Acts of the Apostles becomes important. But of course, both of those books, the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, if Luke is also the author of Acts, are mythologizing that foundational history. There's where I'm more comfortable saying we're talking late first century, maybe second century. And so that, I think, as an epic foundation that's engaging, you see more, I think, there an attempt to not only, again, Paul is in view, but to write something that fits or better matches a genre expectation for a important figure, again, a statesman, a philosopher, a holy man like Jesus is. He's actually really all of those things, but it corresponds more concretely to the expectation of a biography of an important figure at that time. I think Luke is definitely doing that. And then John, often gets dated late, quote unquote, because of a more developed theology. And so you are seeing evidence of continuing conversation there that I think reflect how people are starting to reimagine or answer questions that have arisen about the nature of Christ and how to understand the movement. Does that kind of get at what you were looking for?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so perfectly. Um, and when you look at the double tradition material in Matthew and Luke, in your view, what is in your view the most likely explanation for that? The common material in Matthew and Luke not found in Mark. Do you think one knew the other, Matthew knew Luke, or Luke knew Matthew? Or do you think maybe something like Q, or maybe even multiple sources of the Qs are giving them that information?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to say. I know I think about the work of Mark Goodacre on this issue. I mean, I hope you don't think of this as a cop out, but part of me thinks I don't know. Like, how are we don't know, and wild speculation isn't going to get us any closer. But I think that these authors tended to use a variety of sources. Um, it's possible they had something shared, like a Q, quote unquote, source. I'll give you the caveat that in talking about these things, I would want to be careful about using terms like source, right? And we talk about terminology in the course as well. If you say something like source, it carries a lot of weight. It's kind of like the word community too, right? If we talk about like communities behind the text, or we talk about words like sources, or we talk about even historical Jesus, I like to be very conscious about the weight that those kinds of words carry. So if we talk about source, I think we automatically start to imagine, again, using that analogy of the ladder. And so I think that these writers had a variety of materials at hand. I think if we're interested in trying to figure out what those materials are, we need to ask ourselves why. Because if the question is like, can I then imagine a Q source that is influencing, Matthew and Luke, and that's not in Mark, and therefore that's an oral tradition that blah 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 blah. You see what I mean? Like you got to be careful what that pings in terms of then drawing other conclusions. But I think that there are a variety of materials at the exposure, at the disposal, I should say, of these authors. So I know that's not satisfying, but I don't like to speculate about what they had or didn't have. Certainly, a more linear explanation is something along the lines of breaking down those temporal divides and just saying that they're reading each other. And I don't see a strong reason to not imagine that either.
Hmm. And in my closing question, overall, and yes, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John have differences about how they understand Jesus within their literary and Greco-Roman context. They're writing these very respective texts in. But overall, what do you think the consistent conclusion theme that they're going by to place Jesus in that literary context?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, certainly they don't have literary consistency per se in something like when Jesus becomes God's son, right? In Mark, it's at the baptism, and the other two, it's you know at birth essentially, or at conception. So you see a lot of those kinds of distinctions. The similarities, I think that what you see across all of them relative to what I just said is, for example, sort of exceptional. Let's put Mark aside for a second, but some kind of exceptional event. Okay, let's put it that way. When you get to Matthew and Luke, that exceptional event is like the Annunciation. You are going to give birth to a God baby, or something special about the birth, like a star that's indicating some kind of cosmic symbol that's indicating the status of this child that has been born or is about to be born. Again, you don't really have that in Mark, but you do have Pneuma coming down as a dove, right, to inaugurate Jesus. So some kind of spectacular supernatural event that inaugurates Jesus as God's son. So you always have that kind of symbolic event. You see that with the Greco-Roman literature, whether it's Alexander the Great or there's a text. I think it's an Alexander romance where Olympia she's got an astrologer there who's telling her like she's in the birthing chair, and he's saying like, hold on, because he's watching the stars and he wants her to give birth at exactly the right moment for Alexander to fulfill his destiny, right? That kind of narrative is consistent across the Gospels. Something I wrote about in my book is the empty tomb, the idea of the body disappearing, the physical body disappearing of the figure. Interestingly, Paul tells us Jesus was buried, died and was buried. And some people like John Dominic Crossan have said, well, this is just kind of idiomatic, like they're, kind of like dead and gone, it's just kind of saying it in a casual way. But let's imagine for a second his body was buried and not placed in the tomb. But the idea of the disappearing physical body or the empty tomb as a motif is so pervasive in the ancient world. Richard Miller has written about this, and I think in the book, I say, he identified, I'm just kind of throwing out numbers, it's roughly right, like 85 examples of this, but I found 115, right? Like this is on the level of what we're talking about in terms of apotheosis, missing bodies, people becoming gods. Even things like the miracle stories and the kind of miracle stories you find in the Gospels in the literary tradition of what's called paradoxography. You also have miraculous births, miraculous healings, those kinds of things. Stories about even people coming back from the dead. Those kinds of tales existed already within the literary fabric of the ancient Mediterranean world. And so when the Gospels tell those stories, and this is to the historical Jesus point we started with, the question becomes for us, are they filling in the blanks of what you expect the literary expectation for a figure on this level of Jesus, the claims being made about the significance of Jesus, do you fill in blanks that we don't have about his life, his teachings, his activity with what's already out there in the literary world to say this guy had a special birth, he was super smart. Another thing is teaching in the temple at 12. Alexander the Great was smarter than Aristotle, right? Like all of these great figures always have that kind of story of being like a precocious kid who's smarter than their teachers. So do you fill in the blanks not because you don't have necessarily the information from, say, an oral tradition, not because you're trying to deceive a public, but because you're writing a story about an important figure, and everybody reading this is going to expect. They start off with a special birth narrative. They're a precocious kid. They do these special kinds of works, healings, great teachings. Everyone's confused. People aren't sure who they are. There's misrecognition. There are shipwrecks, right? Or whatever else. But anybody reading this is going to expect those elements of this story for it to be intelligible and for it to grab attention, but also to make a statement about Jesus is on par or greater than all of these other figures you're seeing statues of, you're seeing minted on coins, who, live in the imperial household, right? Who are part of this sort of public mythology about great men. And you have to fulfill those expectations as a literary matter, as a matter of writing this kind of story for people to accept it. Because if you wrote something that didn't correspond with those genre expectations, people wouldn't know what to do with it. And so I think that when you see those elements of the Gospels corresponding to greater Greco-Roman literature, that's one of the takeaways. And then you can get down to the specifics that you see shared across the literature that remains.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Walsh.
Thank you for your time.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.